Welcome. My name is John Park, Director of the Korea Project at the Harvard Kennedy School's Belfer Center. It's terrific to have you all with us today. We'll be examining the North Korean model in the cyber domain in today's conversation. Financially motivated cyber operations, especially cybercrime, represent an increasingly central component of North Korea's strategy for evading sanctions and generating illicit revenue. Today, Priscilla Moriuchi and Alex O'Neill will discuss ongoing trends and future expectations for North Korean financially motivated cyber operations, as well as O'Neill's recent report, Cybercriminal Statecraft. Today's event is co-sponsored by the Korea Project and the Cyber Project, an ongoing partnership, highlighting a lot of the activities happening related to North Korea and cyber. Getting us underway today with welcome remarks is Lauren Zibrek, who is the Executive Director of the Cyber Project at the Kennedy School's Belfer Center. She comes to this role as a 2019 graduate of Kennedy School's mid-career MPA program. Here she runs a policy-relevant cybersecurity and technology policy research program with students and non-resident fellows. Her work focuses on national security issues in cyber and tech, ranging from international conflict, cooperation, and norms to domestic collaboration, diversity, privacy, and supply chain issues. Lauren is the co-founder of the online social media movement called Share the Mic in Cyber, which aims to dismantle racism in cybersecurity and privacy. Since its inception, the movement has garnered over 100 million Twitter impressions and featured participation by our nation's cyber leaders. Lauren served as an intelligence officer in the US Air Force at the beginning of her career. Later, as a civilian intelligence analyst with the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, assigned to the Office of Counterterrorism, she completed 3 war zone deployments. After leaving NGA, she joined the cybersecurity threat intelligence startup Recorded Future and was instrumental in building its public sector business practice. In her role as a senior intelligence analyst, she fused intelligence methodologies with cybersecurity and machine learning technologies to help public and private sector customers improve their cyber posture. Thanks so much for being with us, Lauren. Over to you for your welcome remarks.
Thank you, John. Really appreciate it. As John said, my name is Lauren Zibrek, and I run the Cyber Project here at the Belfer Center. And it's my pleasure today to be co-sponsoring this event with the Korea Project. And I just want to welcome you all to this event. I think this is going to be a really, really interesting discussion between Alex and Priscilla Moriuchi, who, she used to be a Cyber Project fellow. I used to work with her at Recorded Future. I think the world of her. She's amazing. So should be a great discussion. The event today is called the North Korean Model, using cyber capabilities to blunt sanctions and generate illicit revenue. It's really timely, right? There's renewed focus on state-sponsored threats, and with Alex's recently published report, Cybercriminal Statecraft, North Korean hackers' ties to the global underground. The North Korean threat, though, is a really interesting one. In fact, Washington Post Cyber 202 journalist Joseph Marks reported last week that, quote, among top hacking nations, North Korea's the weirdest. And there are lots of great quotes from people in the industry, so you should go check that out. What makes them such a different animal among the big 4 hacking nations? And those are considered to be Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. Well, traditional state cyber operations tend to involve things like espionage, sabotage, or theft of information. And that's really typically what we tend to see from those particular nations. But over the last decade, North Korea has invested heavily in using its cyber capabilities to generate illicit revenue through fraud, through cryptocurrency mining, and outright theft. And this makes sense given their primary goal of regime survival in a sanctions framework that has cut off the country from investment and, of course, through its own self-imposed isolation. The interesting thing is that North Korean financially motivated threat actors have experienced this convergence of interests and tradecraft with cyber criminals, and the tools and methods that North Korean hackers have used resemble those of cyber criminals. So there's this blending of that. So, and Alex's report finds that state-sponsored North Korean hackers have engaged extensively with Russian-speaking cyber criminals to purchase malware, network accesses, and monetization services. And some of those Russian-speaking cyber criminals have documented relationships with the Russian security services. By using its cyber capabilities to generate illicit revenue, North Korea has pioneered a transferable model to other states looking to fund their WMD programs or to, as the title suggests, blunt international sanctions. So it's plausible that countries like Iran or Venezuela or others might follow suit to set up their own programs. North Korean financially motivated cyber operations should therefore be viewed dually as acts of criminality and of statecraft. And so, because of that, it becomes a very complex problem. And so therefore, policy responses should involve both law enforcement and national security communities. So there's so much to unpack in this report. And hearing from both of these experts as well, I think we're going to learn a lot here. So with that, let me introduce Dr. John Park, who just spoke, but he will be the moderator. And as you know, he's the director of the Career Project at the Belfer Center. His core research projects focus on nuclear proliferation, alliances, economic statecraft, North Korean cyber activities, and the political economy of the Korean Peninsula. At Harvard University, he's an associated faculty member of the Korea Institute, a faculty member of the Committee on Regional Studies in East Asia, and a faculty affiliate with the Project on Managing the Atom. He previously directed the Asia Track 1.5 projects at the U.S. Institute of Peace. He advises Northeast Asia policy-focused officials on the U.S. government. And earlier, he worked at Goldman Sachs and the Boston Consulting Group. And he received his PhD from the University of Cambridge. So with that, I'm so excited to turn it back over to John Park and for the ensuing discussion. So thank you so much for having me here today and for the opportunity to co-host.
Terrific framing remarks. Thank you so much, Lauren. With that, it gives me a great honor to introduce our speakers on the panel today. Priscilla Moriuchi is a non-resident fellow with the Career Project at the Belfer Center and works in security engineering and architecture at Apple. She is an expert on state-sponsored cyber operations in Asia-Pacific regional and cyber threats, and is a widely published researcher and commentator on national and cybersecurity issues. Her cutting-edge research on China, Russia, and North Korea has been featured in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, and many others. Priscilla was formerly the head of nation-state research and the principal researcher at Reported Future. Prior to joining the private sector, she spent 12 years at the National Security Agency, most recently as the Enduring Threat Manager and top subject matter expert on East Asia and Pacific cyber threats. Alex O'Neill is an associate of the Career Project and a master's degree candidate in the Russian and Eastern European Studies program at the University of Oxford. Previously, Alex served as coordinator of the Career Project, where he helped oversee all research initiatives and events, including the second Harvard Korean Security Summit. Alex also co-leads the Career Project's North Korea Cyber Working Group and heads a research initiative on the cyber relationship between Russia and North Korea. He graduated from Yale College with a degree in European history. As Lauren mentioned earlier, Alex is the author of a recent Career Project report, which holds the distinction of having the Belfer Center's coolest sounding report title. The full title is Cybercriminal Statecraft, North Korean Hackers' Ties to the Global Underground. So to get us underway, I'd like to turn to you, Priscilla, with this question. What's unique about North Korea's embrace of cybercriminality?
Sure. Thanks for the intro, John, and thanks to all of you for coming. So I don't even know there's one big way to distinguish how different North Korea is, but the way I kind of describe it is this. The Kim family are the leaders essentially of an international organized crime syndicate, right? That's supported and directed by the state. That's what makes them so unique. And I think beyond, we're obviously going to talk about their cyber operational capabilities today, but one of the things that North Korean regime, the Kim family, does particularly well is integrating cyber operations and capabilities with their sort of kinetic, criminal, everyday activities. So, for example, the Kim family exploits both the mechanisms of state, right, both domestically amongst their own citizens and overseas to enable and direct this organized crime, right? So domestically, the party and the military co-opt and sponsor the crime. The local population is forced, manipulated, and coerced into participating. in this kind of labor force for this organized crime operation. And internationally, DPRK embassies and consulates form like the operational hubs for this activity. So when you integrate and kind of overlay, right, cybercrime and DPRK cyber operations over the criminality, right, that the Kim regime has practiced for 40 plus years, you have a really unique situation.
Terrific. And with that, and in setting this context and adding to what Priscilla mentioned there, Alex, I turn to you. And from your research, what you found in terms of the unique quality here from North Korean cyber actors?
Definitely. Well, John, first of all, let me just start with a big thank you to you for organizing this event, to Lauren for those great opening remarks. And let me just add to it, it's a total privilege to get to share the virtual stage with Priscilla, who really is the authority on all things North Korean cyber. So thank you very much for this opportunity. In terms of the uniqueness of North Korea's embrace of cyber criminality, there are a couple of things. The first is that the Belfer Center in 2020 put out the Cyber Power Index, which is a really interesting and useful document of research, in which they say that in terms of using cyber capabilities to generate illicit revenue, North Korea stands alone among states, that is, right? So at the simplest level, in terms of uniqueness, they are the only ones who are doing it. There are reports that China engages in industrial espionage. There are plenty of other countries that do that use cyber capabilities to generate illicit revenue, right? We've heard about El Salvador embracing Bitcoin, things like that. But in terms of using cyber capabilities for illegal revenue generation, North Korea seems to stand alone. And what does that mean? So first of all, in a lot of the operations that we've seen North Korea conducting, specifically financially motivated cyber operations, we've seen North Korean state-sponsored hackers using tools, so malware, using TTPs, and targeting victims that you would see normally in non-state cyber criminal activities, right? That means targeting banks, targeting cryptocurrency exchanges, targeting big corporations. They've engaged in what's called big game hunting, where you go after large companies with lots of cash on hand that are sensitive to downtime. So last year we saw, and this wasn't North Korea, but it's a relevant example, I think, the Colonial Pipeline ransomware hack, things like that, right, where you go after a company that's more likely to pay the ransom. The North Koreans have engaged in similar behavior. They've engaged in wire fraud, bank fraud, all kinds of cryptocurrency scams. The Marine Chain token, for example, was a fraudulent initial coin offering that they put out to raise funds. So it's a quite unique embrace of cyber criminality in that regard, that this state-sponsored entity, these state-sponsored hackers, are using tools, tactics, procedures, and malware that otherwise we would only see cyber criminals using.
So Alex, if I can build on that, what you're laying out here, what Priscilla mentioned, the unique features here, you see North Korean cyber actors using these tools. But if we do the deep dive on your report, one, I think key finding that emerges very quickly is this great connection that you found in terms of North Korean cyber actors working very closely with Russian-speaking cyber criminals. What's the broader significance of this partnership?
Sure. So let me start by just saying that what we found, which is based on open source research, on interviews, conversations, looking at private threat intelligence research, things like that, what we found is that generally speaking, the North Korean state-sponsored hackers' interactions with Russian-speaking cyber criminals falls into three buckets. The first is purchasing malware, often through forums. So that could be ransomware, that could be other kinds of exploit kits that are usually relatively cheap, sort of off-the-shelf things that anyone who knows how to get out of the dark web could potentially buy. The second bucket is purchasing network accesses. Some of these are sold on those same forums. You can buy sort of low-level accesses there. But in certain cases, and this is quite noteworthy, I think, we've seen the North Koreans purchasing higher-level network accesses to banks, to companies, defense contractors, things like that, from some of what are called the more elite Russian-speaking cybercriminal groups. So that I think is a noteworthy finding. And that's based on research that Sahar Nauman at BAE Systems and a couple of other folks have done. But so you have the purchasing malware, you have purchasing network accesses, and network access purchasing means that someone has broken into a network and instead of exploiting it themselves, they transfer that access for a fee to the North Koreans in this case. And then the third bucket has to do with what you might call facilitation services. So that means money laundering, that means hiring money mules to collect cash outs from ATMs that have been programmed to disperse money when given certain commands. It also means hosting the sales of stolen personal payment data, right? So if the North Koreans steal say 100,000 people's credit card information or social security numbers, things like that. They themselves don't want to be the ones to sell it. So for some kind of fee, they'll sell that data to someone else who will then host sales on their web pages. So that's what we mean in terms of their engagement with particularly Russian-speaking cyber criminals. In terms of the significance, there are a couple of things, and we should give a big caveat, which is that North Korea has relatively advanced cyber capabilities internally, right? They can develop their own malware, they can pioneer their own accesses. They have, like Priscilla said, a long history of, in the physical world, working with criminals, organized crime groups, the Japanese Yakuza, for example, things like that. So it's not totally new in that regard, but it does give them more options. It gives them more kinds of malware that they can use. It gives them more options in terms of network access. And it means that perhaps where they might spend a little more time and a little more money working on one project, they can purchase something off the dark web and allocate that money otherwise. The final point that I would make is that by using off-the-shelf ransomware kits in particular that you can find for a couple $100 on the dark web, what that maybe does for North Korea is that it complicates attribution that the US or that the UK might do. If they're using tools that have been used by Russian-speaking actors before, or that so many actors have used, that attribution in terms of saying it belongs to this person or that person, this group or that group, that becomes sort of pointless. And so as much as over time, you can use other, you can look at infrastructure. There are plenty of other ways to do attribution. It can muddle that process and make it take longer, make it more complicated for law enforcement to try to remediate theft or extortion or things like that. So it is quite significant for the North Koreans.
Thanks, Alex. And Priscilla, same question. From your vantage point, what are you seeing in terms of the significance of this partnership?
Yeah, so I think one of the underlying things, the findings that Alex described about the cooperation, right, and integration with the Russian-speaking criminal community, it is revelatory, but also expected at the same time, I think, because North Korean cyber operators are operating in the criminal sphere, right, in the criminal underground. They've been integrated, right, into these communities for a decade or more at this point. We know that North Korean cyber operators, have language capabilities, Russian, Chinese, English, right? So in a way, we were kind of like waiting for this information, right, for these connections to be discovered, because to a certain extent, some of the ideas were already there from the technical analysis of North Korean operations themselves, right? Some of the code overlaps, for example, right? The use of WannaCry, right, which was not developed, right, by North Korean operators. So to me, this was like, great, this is so excellent. We've got this actual evidence now, right? And this is what we've been expecting. So one, like yes, like we are there. North Korea, we should expect, right, to witness the type of integration or cooperation with other, especially like the English language, for example, underground communities as well, right? We should see it. It doesn't necessarily mean that these actors know who they're working with, right? And I think that's one of the big, what's the word? The big policy unknowns, right, from North Korea is like, so Alex's report made these, these great points about, some of the cyber criminals being connected to, Russian intelligence, military intelligence, or law enforcement, right, having connections there or conducted operations there, right? And maybe if we were looking at state-sponsored operators from another country like China or even Iran, right, we could make some more educated policy assumptions about integration or cooperation between these two sets of governments, right? With North Korea, we just can't do that, right? I think, Alex cited in his paper a quote, I think from DOJ, that said, like, we believe, that China and Russia aren't exactly, are maybe supportive, right, or not unknowing, right, of this North Korean criminal activity. And that's a fair statement, right? And so there are different levels, right? So one, right, Russian state could be aware, right, that their operators, right, who they have existing relationships with, are helping to facilitate North Korean crime, and they're okay with that. Two, maybe they're not aware, right, and they're just regular criminals, and they don't know who's on the other end, or maybe they do, right? So the policy implications for both are quite different, right? And it's very unique, again, to North Korea and the model, that they utilize, because it's so distributed and diverse, right? We're pretty sure Kim Jong-un is not calling all the operational shots, that he doesn't understand every single crypto exchange that's getting ripped off and why, right? He's just okay with the methodology, for now is kind of the policy assumption, right? A lot of these kind of lower level operations and how they're facilitated are relatively opaque, right, to him.
So Alex, with what Priscilla mentioned there, one feature that stands out is this distributed and diverse type of setting for these North Korean cyber actors. In your report, what are some of these key trends that you're looking at with respect to North Korean financially motivated cyber operations? And then with that, what do you expect to see in the next 5 years?
Sure. So there are a couple things that I could say. I'll make just a few points. One is that I think considering the amount of money and the amount of interest that's pouring into cryptocurrencies and things like NFTs, I think it's safe to say that North Korea will continue to exploit vulnerabilities in that front. The North Korea Cyber Working Group here at the Korea Project has done some really great work in that regard, looking at North Korea's exploitation of crypto in particular. So I think that's only going to increase. I note there was a really great Chainalysis report from, I think, January, where they noted that 2021 was likely North Korea's most lucrative year in terms of stealing from crypto exchanges. They took something like $400 million. And bear in mind as well that when these numbers are calculated for reports, obviously you have a set number of Bitcoin or Ethereum or what have you. And if the value of the coins rise, right, if the country hasn't sold their holdings, then the value increases even more. So there's that potential for sort of on the back end, even further growth in what they have. So all that is to say, I think a continued and increasing embrace of crypto theft, crypto fraud, fraudulent initial coin offerings, things like that. That's one point. A sort of converse point to that is that I think with all the money and all the attention that's gone into crypto in particular, there are rumblings of, especially in the US, increased regulation. That's both in terms of sort of KYC, knowing who you're dealing with. It's also in terms of cybersecurity, right, requiring things like multi-factor authentication and all sorts of other security measures. I think what we're going to see is that in places, especially in the United States, where there are the resources and there's sort of the political will now to embrace further regulation and to improve cybersecurity, to make some of these US-based exchanges sort of hardened targets, if you will, that becomes more difficult for North Korea to attack. On the flip side, there are a lot of places where there may be crypto exchanges based, but perhaps there isn't the same level of attention or money in that specific country. They may also just not have the resources. There may not be the capacity to build up cybersecurity there. So I think what we're going to see is a continued trend of North Korea going after what you might call sort of the lowest hanging fruit, right? Because you can have, if there are 10 big crypto exchanges and 9 of them have the best cybersecurity, it's very difficult to break into. At the very least, it'll take a long time. If there's one of them that's a lot less well protected, then chances are the North Koreans are going to go after that. And so I think, unfortunately, what that means is that crypto exchanges that are based in third countries, in countries that don't have necessarily that capacity or that attention devoted to cybersecurity, I think we're going to see North Korea increasingly targeting them. And they already have, certainly over the last 5 or 7 years, but I think that's going to increase.
So Priscilla, looking at that 5-year period, and it's not so much an exercise in predicting the future, but just analyzing these trend lines. As you see North Korea with this accumulated learning, with this learning by doing, and in its own way, this kind of growth mindset, what do you see as essentially where these trends are growing based on the current activities here in that 5-year time horizon?
Sure, I would extrapolate a little bit to, or sort of build on what Alex talked about, and that's, I would encompass the entire world of decentralized finance, right, or DeFi, as it's sort of referred to now. That includes, right, cryptocurrencies. It also includes NFTs, blockchain-based companies and startups, video games, right? So, sort of extrapolating at that 5-year kind of time frame, we're looking at an entire ecosystem, right, that's being built around a technology that the North Koreans fundamentally understand, right, and have understood since sort of the beginning of when it became, a broadly utilized global asset, right? So all of these places, right, I think exchanges will continue, sort of said, like Alex said, to be kind of low-hanging fruit, right? But that the environment amongst like developers, right, and entrepreneurs and people starting these companies, right, is one where, there's generally not a lot of funding around, right? And for most corporations, security is a concern, right? But when you're just trying to make some money or get funding, right, it's secondary. And I think you can see that if you look at the techniques that the North Koreans are using to gain access to these exchanges, especially recently, the hack of the video game company, right, in which they end up with somewhere in the range of like, hundreds of millions of dollars worth of ether, equivalent. So is that, the employees are developing, right? Sometimes they're developing for a number of different startups or companies. They're looking for ways, in many cases, to be parlaying these sort of trading skills, right? Trading other currencies at the same time. So they're looking for trading apps and they're looking to hire people really quickly, all these things that allow you to kind of click on links and download things that maybe you shouldn't. Right. So that's one. So the whole idea of decentralized finance. Two is it's underreported because it's really not well understood or known. But North Koreans also likely, right, get a lot of their revenue from just normal IT work. Right. So as it becomes easier to hide your physical location, your identity online, into platforms like Upwork and Freelancer and stuff, that also makes it easier for North Korean operators to not do like the dirty criminal work, but to do legitimate IT work, help people set up their websites, their mail exchanges, those types of things that we've seen them do in the past, right? And that are lucrative jobs for relatively little, technical aptitude, right? And people don't know who they're purchasing from, right? So they're paying $500, and for a service that they need anyway, and it just happens to be North Korean that they don't know on the other side. I think also, like I sort of alluded to earlier, North Korean operators are integrated into the criminal scene, right? Russian language speaking, probably English language scene, maybe French as well. So whatever we see there, we should expect to see that coming from North Korean operators in some capacity as well. Even, ransomware, right? Either as a diversion, right, for a bank operation or as a larger, revenue generating operation. These are all things that I kind of expect.
A lot going on. And as you mentioned, Priscilla, the North Korean cyber actors have been there from a very early stage. So this is something that they're kind of homegrown talent and expertise in this area, really something for us to take into account. This leads me to the final question. And Alex, I'm going to tee this up for you first. One of the core elements of your report was the recommendation to focus more on law enforcement. What do you see as the core benefits of treating North Korean cybercrime as a law enforcement issue in addition to a national security issue?
Sure. So a couple of points, and I know Priscilla has a ton to say on this as well. But the points that I would raise are that we should be treating this dually as a criminal issue and as an issue of statecraft, right? And so the folks who should be handling the response should be both people in law enforcement and people in the national security establishment. The reason that I say that is if you look at the US response, just to begin with, right? We have folks who deal with cybercrime on a daily basis, right? They know the technical elements very well. There are US attorneys' offices, for example, the Western District of Pennsylvania deals with a ton of computer crime. It's their bread and butter, right? So they know this stuff very well. We should be involving those people, even if the hacks are taking place outside of the United States or not directly involving exchanges that are based in the US, for example, right? If we're investigating, we should have law enforcement folks with that kind of expertise, career investigators dealing with that. On the flip side, right, if you're an investigator who deals with computer crime, North Korea, chances are, is not something that you see every day. So having folks who are well-versed in all things North Korea, having folks who are quite familiar and who have a role in developing United States foreign policy and especially policy toward North Korea, it's important to bring those two groups together, is the first point. The second point I would make kind of goes back to what I said in the very beginning, which is that the nature of the North Korean financially motivated cyber operations themselves has sort of one foot in the criminal side and one foot in the statecraft side, right? And so that it's not that it falls sort of in the spectrum in between. It's not that it's mostly one, but has a little bit of the other. It really is fundamentally, they're doing things illegally, they're committing fraud, committing theft, they're using tools that criminals tend to use and tactics, techniques and procedures that criminals tend to use online, but they're doing it in order to fund things like the nuclear weapons program, ballistic missile research, things like that. And that's, of course, partly speculation, but the UN panel of experts in North Korea has reported that. There's plenty of media reporting to that effect as well. So it really does have the hard characteristics both on the criminal side and on the statecraft side. And so for that reason, I guess the main point of this section of the report is that we should have folks from the law enforcement community and from the national security community handling the response jointly.
So before turning to Priscilla for the final question here, I invite audience members to use the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen to send your question over, and we'll get into Q&A shortly here. Priscilla, as an advisor and mentor to Alex and other researchers with the CREA project, you've long highlighted the important role that law enforcement plays. Can you provide a little more context? And this is something that as a message resonates very clearly, but this is something that you've been looking at for a long period of time, and you have been mentioning the central role of law enforcement for a long period of time as well. So a little more in terms of the context of where that came from is super helpful.
Sure. So as I mentioned before, the DPRK operational model is distributed, it's diverse. There's no like single silver bullet, right? Or one solution. So it involves a lot of different parties chipping away at it at the same time. So the nature of this model, right, is that it relies on a bunch of different nodes, both physical and virtual nodes, that are present in different countries and in different realms, right? On the internet, the virtual world, and in the physical world. So it's not a problem, you know, it's the number one point. It's not a problem that one type of, just the intelligence community, you know, can tackle, right? It requires many different types of tools, right? And non-traditional partnerships. So that's one. From number two is that, you know, from a signal perspective, right? Although certainly DPRK cyber operators go after big companies and do kind of the big game hunting, like Alex was saying, by volume, like the largest number by volume of victims are like normal people and small companies and startups, and they're most likely to go to their local law enforcement partners, right, rather than calling up the FBI, right, or, you know, the NSA when they need to. So empowering and creating mechanisms where law enforcement, right, have access to knowledge already, right? So it's easier to share knowledge when in the law enforcement domain outside of classified channels, right? We have many of those mechanisms already in place globally, right? We're integrating countries, right, that are non-traditional partners when it comes to tackling North Korean crime, nuclear security issues. Right, so information sharing is easier. We get a better source of signal if we're integrating law enforcement agencies from around the world, because they have the integration and the interactions with their local populations who are calling them up and saying, hey, you know, like I'm a small scale exchange in Kenya and I just got, you know, ripped off. Like, who's going to help them, right? It's going to be Kenyan law enforcement. It's not going to be the FBI. So that's one. Like, to a certain extent, DPRK, knowingly or unknowingly, right, are exploiting this intelligence model, right, where there's a group of countries and a group of agencies, you know, who have most of the information and do most of the countering and the analysis, and that's just not the way their operations work. So that's point number two. I say point number three is the law enforcement coalitions and training. So North Korean cybercrime is crime, right? And we should be utilizing these mechanisms to increase training for local law enforcement, to get them to understand the various information points, right? What information do you need to prosecute, right? Or to prove, or to make a case, right? That relies on, you know, information on the internet. You need DNS information, you need IP, you need all this stuff. So utilizing those training mechanisms to kind of bring up the baseline level for law enforcement knowledge across the world. And that will inevitably help us fight DPRK crime, right? And countering revenue generating operations and disabling them from nuclearization and all those sort of knock-on effects, right, are at their base level, right, enabled by crime, right, which we have the mechanisms to address.
Very compelling reasons, and we'll certainly be looking more at the law enforcement role as this threat continues to grow. So to our panelists, our first question comes from Professor Matt Bunn. with managing the Atom project at the Belfer Center. And Priscilla, this is actually directed to a comment that you mentioned related to the North Korean IT workers. And so Professor Bunn's question is, does a legitimate work give them access that allows them or others to launch thefts and ransomware attacks?
Thus far, we don't have examples of the legitimate IT work enabling crime, simply enabling revenue generation. That being said, doesn't mean it hasn't happened, but for the most part, it's pretty like mom and pop, low scale, low level, setting up mail servers, putting websites together. But like I said, I would expect that to change. So it's a definite possibility.
Thank you. And Alex, a question that came over email, this is for you, and it relates to, in the course of your research, how certain can we be about North Korea's cyber priorities, goals, chain of command, etc.? What have you found in your research regarding these topics?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I would say the answer is that we should be skeptical of a lot of what we hear. I think, first of all, the visibility that we have into, forget about North Korea for a second, the visibility that we have into just the technical elements of a lot of the operations that takes place is quite limited. Oftentimes, the way that information about these kinds of operations comes into the public discourse is that a bank or a company or a government, whoever it is who is targeted, will engage with a company like FireEye or CrowdStrike or something like that to investigate. And in the course of their IR, their instant response, they'll get a lot of great details, and eventually they'll publish some kind of report, either publicly or through private sort of subscription-based channels to clients. The thing is that a lot of their proprietary methods are kept out of those reports, and therefore a lot of the critical sort of technical information there doesn't reach the public discourse. So there are certain things that we just don't know when it comes to financially motivated cyber operations, broadly speaking. When it comes to North Korea, right, which folks have been calling the hermit kingdom, things like that, right, there's that extra layer of not having information. A couple of things that we would love to know about is the command structure. So how does North Korea's sort of cyber command, how does it go down the chain? We'd love to know about their development infrastructure. There's been plenty of speculation that North Korea has basically a shared development pool where the same folks are working on certain programs, and then people who are doing financially motivated operations or espionage or cyber or sabotage, things like that, may use at least some of the same kind of overlapping tools. But again, this is speculation based on what we see and what's reported in the real world. It's not based on documents that we have from North Korea for the most part. It's not based on interviews with folks who are coming out of North Korea. And I would just add one sort of footnote to that last point. There was a great CSIS report from 2015 on North Korean cyber operations. And one of the points that they raise is that North Korea may in fact spread, they use the term disinformation, to folks who are in North Korea, who are working at their cyber directorates, and give, for example, the incorrect names or purposes of certain divisions, certain organs there, so that if people do defect, the information that's being given to the US or to other countries is incorrect. And so there really is that element of creating smoke screens. So that, to sum it all up, I would say there's a lot that we don't know, and a lot of the information that we have seems like it's good, but we should treat everything quite skeptically, because at the end of the day, we can't really be certain.
So anything to add on that? I mean, this is something that I imagine this is going back to your earlier career. And if there are topics that you can't mention, just raise your right eyebrow and we'll get the message. But this is a topic that I know is a priority focus for many of the researchers. And so this is certainly an evolving space. But yeah, anything that you can share?
Yeah, so I think we can make some moderate confidence assumptions, right, based on the sort of North Korean operational model in the sort of kinetic and criminal world, right? So most of the embassies and consulates operate under the self-sustaining model, right, in which they have to generate a certain amount of their own operating revenue for their own operating costs, right? And there are press reporting from around the world of embassies and consulates in different countries, doing this in different ways, like smuggling precious jewels and gems and endangered species and cigarettes and cars and booze. And so one, I think we can draw a little bit of a conclusion, but we can make an assumption there that there's not a lot of guidance from the regime about how you make the money, right? You make it and you do it, And only, it seems, if you've gone too far beyond some kind of line is the hand slapped or someone's brought back to, Pyongyang, or something happens, right? So you see that there's a lot of scope, right? For a long time, there's a consulate or an embassy in Germany that ran a youth hostel, right? It was just like there, people go and stay there, right? Backpackers and things. So one, I would agree with Alex that we don't necessarily know, but we can make some judgments that it's not inherently centrally directed, right? The operations themselves, the techniques, the operators are giving kind of broad leverage, right, to generate the revenue in whatever ways, they might need to. That being said, I think that there are certainly lines that have been articulated, not with words, right, but with actions, by the Kim regime. For example, if you look at the Sony Pictures Entertainment attack in 2014, right, something of that scale and that specific operational model, right, has not occurred since then, right? And so why, or, is an open question, but that remains a fact that there was something there within the context of that operation, right? Whether it was the type of target, whether it was the threefold sort of, disruptive cyber operations, along with the threat against movie theaters, right? There's a whole many elements, right, to that SPE attack and operation, right, that were not repeated again, right? It could have been a different focus or something, but it was clearly something, right, that's some kind of line, right, that has yet to be repeated. So that didn't become a normal part of operations like a lot of people kind of thought, it might be at that time. I think the other part is that if you look at the model of what little we know, right, about North Korean intelligence services, whether it's the RGB or the North Korean MSS, they have loose missions, right? They have guidelines, right? Some offices specialize in certain things, right? But you will frequently see, for example, actor groups, right, doing both state-sponsored traditional espionage and revenue-generating criminal operations at the same time. Right? They're equal kind of patience and tactics and professionalism applied to both, and they're conducted by ostensibly the same people in the same unit, right? But if you were to approach that from a United States or a Chinese perspective, or even a Russian, those are different operational outcomes, right? And you wouldn't have the same unit doing both of those things regularly because they require sort of different skill sets. So from my perspective, we can make some kind of assumptions about like what's acceptable and what's not. We're not really sure where the lines are, right? But I think we sort of understand there's not a, sort of Kim Jong-un directed, right, go after this crypto exchange and do these things, but more like a desire for the outcome, right, which is generating lots of revenue.
So before going to the next question from a Harvard Kennedy School student, Yejung Chung, Priscilla, I just wanted to quickly follow up what you related to earlier about this cyber heist where the North Koreans stole cryptocurrency from the Ronin network, a gaming site. And as you mentioned, the key word that you dropped was the equivalent, and the reporting was the equivalent of $620 million. So clearly North Korea has this bottleneck, and a very severe bottleneck, and frankly, a barrier in many instances of converting cryptocurrency that they steal to fiat. Can you break that down? Why is it so difficult for North Korean cyber actors to convert that into fiat currency?
I would say it has been difficult and is likely to get easier, unfortunately. So one, it wouldn't be difficult for North Korean operators if they didn't seem to care whether the trail was followed, right? So if you look at FBI indictments, research around large-scale crypto thefts, one of the biggest traits that you'll see is that North Korean operators go through several levels of, I would say, transactions, right, to maintain or gain anonymity, to the point that they're losing money at each, sometimes between 10%, 5%, 15%, right, at each transaction. So one, like, if they didn't care about anybody knowing where the crypto was going and what currency it was being exchanged to and how, then they would just go from Ether, right, to dollars, or Bitcoin to renminbi, right? Because you can do that now. So the mechanisms that have been created, right, by the crypto community, specifically mixers, right, which allow you essentially an algorithm will conduct tens of thousands of transactions in order to obfuscate, right, where the original coins and bits came from, so that they are essentially anonymized on the way out. Right, those type of technologies are being more well understood by law enforcement, and it's easier to break those sort of mixer chains today. Kind of that's one. But two, my concern going forward is that in the whole decentralized finance space, we are moving towards a time in which there are more currencies that are fungible, right? That are exchangeable for fiat across the world, whether it be renminbi or yuan or dollars or rubles or whatever. And so that actually eases the transition of, crypto to what we believe they need, which is hard currency. I think the other side of that is like, what can you buy for cryptocurrency these days, right? Without converting it to fiat cash? We still don't know. And I think that's still it's a valuable open question. What can you get, for crypto? Can you buy coal? Can you buy oil? Can you buy cables? Can you buy time on a ship, right? Can you create your own shipping, blockchain-based shipping conglomerate, right? And there you don't even have to have any overlap, right, with traditional finance space. So it is difficult, has been difficult in the past. We've seen North Korea utilize many degrees of separation, but I think unfortunately it's going to get easier for them, even with the sort of pushing of regulation and KYC requirements across the world.
Very helpful. Alex, the question from Yejun, if I were to paraphrase, goes something like this. Yeah, we're seeing already a lot of China-North Korea economic cooperation, reporting that our group has done as well, looking at sanctions evasion. Commercial hubs in China play a critical role in North Korean sanctions evasion activities in that space. So Yejun was wondering, you've looked at this connection between the Russian-speaking actors here and the North Korean cyber actors. Did you find anything in terms of some of the Chinese players and some of the North Korean players when it comes to cyber operations?
So I think it's a really good question. Unfortunately, in the scope of my research and for my report, I didn't really focus at all on the China angle for a couple of reasons. One, just because personally my background is more on the Russia side than it is on the China side. But I will say, so the genesis of the report was that I was hoping to look at the state level relationship on cyber issues between Russia and North Korea. And undoubtedly, there is also a serious state level relationship when it comes, and I use the term cyber here very broadly. So I mean infrastructure, internet infrastructure provision, things like that. But it's known that China, the same way that Russia does, there are Chinese firms that are connecting North Korea basically to the global internet. And so there's plenty to look into there. I would be highly skeptical, and it's quite possible that there is something, but I would be highly skeptical of claims that there is operational level collaboration when it comes to being in the same room conducting some kind of operation together between agents of the Chinese state and agents of the North Korean state. I think it's something that we haven't seen, and the folks that I've spoken to who research this for a living, folks who have experience in government, are quite skeptical about that. At the same time, I would highlight a sort of interesting trend. A friend of mine and a former colleague, Brendan Brennan, who's a member of the North Korea Cyber Working Group, was looking into last year Chinese attribution of North Korean cyber operations. And he found what looks like an interesting trend looking at these threat intelligence reports coming out of China from Chinese firms and from the Chinese government. And they tended, at least when he was in the period he was looking at it, they tended not to say North Korea or this group that we have identified as being North Korean is responsible for this operation. They tended to say, a state group or a non-state group based in Northeast Asia conducted this operation. And so there's a certain element, everyone knows who it is, but there's a certain element of sort of not identifying, not participating in that naming and shaming campaign that the US has spearheaded through its indictments. And the US has detailed in such a painstaking fashion the infrastructure the North Koreans have used, the details down to the very preliminary, spear phishing links and things like that. And I think it seems like there's been a concerted effort on the part of the Chinese to avoid sort of exposing North Korea in that sense. But the short answer to the question is, I think there is definitely plenty to be said about the China-North Korea cyber relationship, but I've not found anything really substantial in that regard in the course of my research personally.
So Priscilla, if you could add to that, and I also like to give you the opportunity to essentially the key findings from a report that you did when you were with Record a Future, which is a part of a syllabus of some of the courses we teach here at Kennedy School, looking at analysis. It's the metadata analysis that you did on the Chinese broadband pipeline that connects North Korea. Fascinating in terms of what you found there. But if you could comment a little more about what you see in the China-North Korea relationship, and also from that Recorded Future report, that was super helpful.
Sure. So I think what we could broadly say is that Chinese state is willing to give North Korea the platform, the technology, right, the physical location, to conduct cyber operations. They're willing to look the other way, right, when it comes to prosecuting crimes, which for Chinese citizens, right, many of them would go to jail for, right? They're quite aggressive, right, in pursuing Chinese citizens who are doing the exact same activities, right, on their soil, and sending them to jail for lengthy periods of time. So one, like, the Chinese government is willing to provide the physical infrastructure, right? The cables, the pipes, right? They're willing to facilitate hardware, right? The actual servers and computers and things like that. They're willing to provide physical location, right? In China itself, primarily, if we're to believe kind of defectors, in the kind of border area and the cities around there, in the North Korean Chinese border. To look the other way, right, when the operations are brought to light. So that's one. So I think at the state level, right, there's, like Alex said, there's not a cooperation necessarily. We're trying to sort of saying like, okay, we'll give you, right, all these things, you know, as long as you don't do X, Y, and Z. Because to me, it seems like those X, Y, and Z things would be like missile testing and things that the Kim regime still keeps doing regardless. So they're willing to provide that platform, right? Second, I think on the other sort of side of that is, Alex sort of pointed this out, and I think it's an assumption that's made sort of when you see governments agree to do things like information technology cooperation or cybersecurity cooperation, right? There's sort of a hope, right, that maybe we'll find the Russians and the Chinese sitting at computers, you know, together in the same room and attacking us, and that will be our smoking gun, and then we can say, you know, all these things, right? The same with North Korea and China, or China and the Russian state. And if you look at the malware, if you look at the infrastructure, the IPs, the virtualized virtual machines, all the actual, the ones and zeros, the bits, the hard work, the blood, sweat, and tears that go into an operation, that's rarely shared. Even in, I think, the most sharing you're going to get, and we really see, is in that cyber criminal world, right? In which people are selling, right, pay-per access, right? In which we have an access, like Alex was saying, the North Koreans will purchase, you know, they give them, you know, they'll pay that, they'll pay per installs, right? You get a malware and it's like a subscription service, right? Well, it'll give you like 2,000 installs, right, for this particular piece of malware. So that is where we see the kind of sharing of actual code and techniques that we don't see, you know, at the state to state level. And maybe that will form the baseline for other types of sharing, you know, that we don't necessarily see today. But, you know, that type of operational sharing, you know, we just don't really see very often.
Thank you. This leads us to our final question, and the question comes from Ayong Shin from Washington, D.C. And I'll start off with you, Alex. Ayong asks, what are the potential areas or ways for the U.S. and South Korea to cooperate at a practical level in countering North Korea cyber operations? Specifically, as related to the topic of our discussion today, generating illicit revenue and evading sanctions. And so, you know, with this question, also looking at it from a very interesting angle in terms of what do you see the two countries, what do you think they should prioritize? You know, clearly there's a menu of activities they can do on this cooperation collaboration front, but what would you prioritize? Over to you, Alex. So
I'd start by going back to the very beginning of this conversation where we talked about the sort of dual law enforcement and national security approaches to dealing with this. And Priscilla spoke a great deal about the global partnerships the US has when it comes to law enforcement, when it comes to dealing with North Korean financially motivated cyber operations. I would say one thing that doesn't get enough play, in my opinion, in a lot of this broader discussion, is the fact that there may not always be a direct analog for, say, the FBI or the subunit of the FBI or a certain US Attorney's Office. I mentioned the one in the Western District of Pennsylvania, which is the Pittsburgh Field Office. There may not be exact analogs on the other side with every single country that we're dealing with, right? So that's one point. And so figuring out those channels, does the point person at the FBI who's working on this deal with someone at an investigative agency in South Korea or in the UK or in France or what have you? Is there someone else? Do they go through diplomatic channels? Figuring out exactly how those cooperations should go is one angle. Another sort of wrinkle in that department is that the laws, the rules, the procedures that we have in the US in terms of investigating, in terms of the surveillance you can do, the information that you can gather on folks you suspect are participating in or enabling North Korean cybercrime, right? Those are different in every country, right? They may be more permissive, they may be less permissive, but there are different policies and different rules, standards like probable cause, what it takes to get a warrant, things like that. And so you may find yourself in situations where an American FBI agent wants to do something that's totally legal in the US, but in fact violates South Korean procedure or vice versa. And so figuring out those particular hurdles, I think, is quite important. I would just add that the US and South Korea had what seemed like a really productive summit, and they launched a working group having to do with cybersecurity. It doesn't seem like much has come from that group so far. And in fact, doesn't seem like it's been terribly active, at least until this point. So I would say, to answer Ayung's question, perhaps the first step is rejuvenating that process a little bit, giving the resources that those folks need to bring that working group from the sort of preliminary idea stage into that practical cooperation, looking at on the ground different operations that they can cooperate on.
And final question to you as well, Priscilla. So out of the menu of choice in US-South Korea cooperation in addressing these North Korean cyber operations, what would you prioritize, especially as we have a new government coming in South Korea, the Yoon administration, where President-elect Yoon, as a former prosecutor and someone who comes from essentially a law enforcement background, what would you see as an area that we should prioritize in this bilateral setting?
Sure. I think history has shown us that South Korea is the tip of the spear for North Korean cyber operations. There are many examples of tactics that are broadly utilized across the globe today that where they were first understood, right, spotted, detected in South Korea. Right? They did crypto jacking, right? Cryptocurrency being stolen and utilized, right? North Koreans were doing that in South Korea. So they operationally and experientially, right? South Korea is experiencing operations, tactics, techniques, right? That could likely be deployed across the wider world years, months, right? Before they're deployed, before they actually are. So I think, you're sort of alluding to the new president's background, like perhaps he is the right person to get those like lower, I mean, just sort of bureaucratically lower level cooperation and agreements and people together, right? Because those like ATM, right? For example, there's a big ATM fraudulent scheme in South Korea years and years ago, right? That preceded the whole large ATM cash out scheme that was perpetuated by North Korea, right? But that wasn't really paid attention to much in the West because people just thought, oh, it's just an ATM malware, right? But like those types of things, right? If you're on the ground level, and you're relatively low and your job, right, is to work on those type of operations, that's what you want to know, right? When it's happening, if you're in the West and you want to be able to help and you want to understand where that's coming from so you can prevent it, globally. So, I really do think like getting those mechanisms started and sharing what people might think is kind of the mundane, ho-hum, low-level crime, the impact of that we can not overestimate, right, years in the future.
I think you both highlighted the hallmark of a great research project is that it generates more research questions and more research topics going forward. So this has been a great discussion. I'm now moving to the thank you portion of the event, and starting off, deep thanks to Lauren for being such a great partner with the Career Project and the Cyber Project. This has been really fruitful as a partnership, and there'll be more in the pipeline there as well. And thank Lauren as well for her great framing remarks, getting the discussion going. To Alex, congratulations again on this report. And to the audience, in a recent White House press conference, a reporter asked Jake Sullivan about this link between North Korean cyber actors and Russian actors as well. And the National Security Advisor essentially validated Alex's core thesis. And so that's a phenomenal outcome for Alex's very first report. So congratulations on that, Alex. And Priscilla, you continue to be a phenomenal mentor to our students and our researchers with the Korea project at the Belfer Center. So thank you so much with the generosity of sharing your insights and your wisdom and your tradecraft as more and more students and researchers are looking to specialize in this important area. A word of thanks to our funder, the Korea Foundation. They made Alex's report possible there, and another great partner as we continue to grow this space. And a big thank you to you, the audience members, for joining us today. We'll have more events. The Korea Project continues to look at the Korean Peninsula as a historical of global trends, as these functional issues play out very quickly, and almost as a laboratory, there's a lot of great evidence that we're able to piece together for these kind of projects. And you saw an example of that today as well. So we look forward to engaging you on this as well. Thank you all for joining, and thanks again to our speakers. Good afternoon.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.